Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be discussing the topic of homosexuality in our continuing study of biblical ethics. Former President Barack Obama said back in 2006, I believe in civil unions that allow a same-sex couple to visit each other in a hospital or transfer property to each other. He went on to say, I don't think it should be called marriage. And there was a change of opinion on his part later on. He went on to say, but I think that it is a legal right that they should have as that's recognized by the state. He went on to say, if people find that controversial, and people have, he said, then I would just refer to them to the Sermon on the Mount, which I think is, in my mind, for my faith, more central than an obscure passage in Romans. I would say two things. First of all, that maybe he hasn't read all the Sermon on the Mount, because Jesus has some things to say about morality and sexual morality in that sermon. Especially if you look at Matthew's version of Sermon on the Mount, the larger, more expanded version. But then I would also say that we're not dealing with a obscure passage in Romans, but the foundational area of the book of Romans, in Romans chapter 1. So what do we do about this issue of homosexuality? It is possible to hold two different positions. There are two basic positions with regard to this issue, this question of homosexuality. First of all, that such activity is part of God's creation plan. There are some people that actually that want to believe that. Sometimes I wonder if they do, or if they're just stating something so that they can justify an action. But I'm going to try to assume the best on their behalf. Either it is part of God's creation plan, or else it's not part of the original plan for humanity. It's one or the other. Either this was part of God's design, or it wasn't. So let's look Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, where God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And then God does this in verse 27, and God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Notice, male and female, he created them. And so we have that very specific, that God created, people, male and female. Not male and female, or not female and female, but male and female. Now, feelings of attraction toward those of the same gender, they do exist, but there can be several different ways that this can be brought about. First of all, these feelings can be from a very early age, where this happens, and not denying it. Sometimes that happens from a very early age. Sometimes, and it's interesting to note how often somebody who wrestles with that homosexuality, or maybe even embraces it, has been seduced by a person of the same gender while he or she was still a child. And the rates of that go up exponentially among those who are homosexual, where there's been some sort of very early contact. Or there might be feelings due to some abuse by those of the opposite gender, which makes people not trust or feel safe with those of that opposite gender. Somebody maybe a boy who had a very hateful or oppressive or hurtful father figure, and runs away from that, and then finds himself finding comfort in somebody of the or someone who had a very oppressive mother figure. It can happen in a variety of ways. Very oftentimes, not always, but very oftentimes, one who engages or is tempted by that lifestyle comes from a very dysfunctional family. Now, Leviticus chapter 18, this is several times in the law. You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. Unless you think this was just sort of pulled out of context, let's just read some of the the corresponding passages that are alongside it. Verse 23, you shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. That's a perversion. Verse 24, do not defile yourself by any of these things, for by all these the nations that I'm casting you out before you have become defiled. So homosexuality back in that day was practiced by other nations. It wasn't something unheard of. And God was telling his people, don't do that. Don't you do that. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13, another passage in Leviticus. If there is a man who lies with a male, as those who lie with a woman, both of them have committed a detestable act, they shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. And so this was something for which someone was put to death. This was not a light thing. This was something that was a capital offense in ancient Israel. Now let's move from there to the New Testament. In the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and following, Paul says, do you not know that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators. And now that's could be, man and woman. So notice this, not the homosexuality is not the only sin listed here, but it's one of several. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals. And then it goes on to say, nor thieves, nor, and notice the covetous. Wow. Because covetousness is something that a lot of us, in fact, I almost venture to say all of us, have entered into this. And he goes on to say, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers. So he doesn't limit it, although the first several of those are of a sexual nature, he does not limit that. None of those shall inherit the kingdom of God. You see, it's listed as one of the sins. It's not listed as the worst sin. I'm not trying to pick on that particular sin, even though that's the topic of our topic for this talk. But it's one of a number. But notice, the point that I'm making is it's one of those. It's a sin. He's not saying it's an okay thing. Paul was saying, no, it is a sin, and there are other sins too. But it is a sinful action. When he says nor homosexuals, the Greek word arsenoikoitis, the term arsen is just the Greek word for male, and the koite is the word for bed. So one who takes a male to bed, and it's not addressing women, but it's saying that was just the regular term. It was the euphemistic term, and a nice way of saying it, polite way of saying it, of describing somebody who engaged in homosexual behavior. And that's in the list of those that were wrong in which to engage. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8, Paul says, we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, realizing the fact that the law was not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious. We don't, the reason we have speed limits, for example, is because some people exceed them. And the law was made for those who are lawless and rebellious. He goes on to say, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers and immoral men, notice, and homosexuals, and kidnappers and liars and perjurers and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching. So notice that homosexual activity is not placed in a sort of realm by itself, but it's listed as one of these things that you shouldn't be doing. Now, we're going to Romans chapter 1. This is that passage that former President Barack Obama said was obscure. I don't think it is. Paul in this passage is talking about how people have rejected God, even though the evidence for God is built into creation. They have turned away from him. And here in verse 26, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the women, and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts, and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. That is, this was not the way for which men and women were designed, but in their rebellion against God, this is one of the ways that rebellion is manifested. It's not the only way, but it's one of those ways in which people turned from that for which they had been designed, and they went to a different way of approaching the genders. Verse 28. Verse 28, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper. He goes on to say, verse 29, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, and they are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. Notice there's a whole lot of other sins that are mentioned too. It's not just homosexuality. Verse 32, and although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give heartily approval to those who practice them. There is something about, and again, this passage isn't picking just on homosexuality. It mentions it, but there's something about sin, and about all sorts of sins, that those who engage in all sorts of sins, homosexuality included, not only do those things, but they try to give approval to other people that practice them. That sin, we have this expression that misery loves company. Sin loves company. And sin tries to justify itself. That's the very nature of sin. Now, the case for homosexuality, and I'm not saying this to endorse it, but I'm saying these are the arguments that are made in favor of homosexuality. First of all, it's claimed that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I haven't mentioned Sodom and Gomorrah yet, I almost don't need to, you know the story, but it's claimed that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah did not involve their homosexuality. And the passage that's used for this isn't Genesis chapter, chapter 18 that tells the story, and 19, but Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49-50, where Ezekiel says, behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and needy. Thus they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it. And it's true. I would say it's true that Sodom and Gomorrah, in addition to that homosexual encounter, where the men of this city tried to rape, demand that they be able to rape these two male visitors. Turned out they were angels, but they didn't know that. In addition to that, they were inhospitable, and that's mentioned here, probably because the people to whom Ezekiel is addressing, they might be thinking, well, we're not as bad as them. We didn't engage in their activity. He says, well, you engaged in some of their activity, even if you didn't do that specific area. And that's true. It wasn't the only sin that they committed, but it was one of them. Jude chapter 1 verse 7 actually points that out. Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, in the same way as those indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, again a polite way of describing it, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. And they're an example of that. Now, secondly, it's claimed that Leviticus chapter 20 verse 13, which we read earlier, it's claimed that it refers only to ceremonial purity rather than moral behavior. But we looked at the context, and that's just not the case. It's given in the context of other immoral outward actions. Leviticus chapter 20 verse 13, if there's a man who lies with a male as those who lie with a woman, both of them shall have committed a detestable act, they shall surely be put to death. All we need to do is to look at the context. If we go back a few verses, verse 10 cites the case of a man who commits adultery with another man's wife and says that they will be put to death. We go on to verse 11, that speaks of a man who has sexual relations with his father's wife. And again, we see that they're both to be put to death. Verse 12 speaks of the man who has sexual relations with his daughter-in-law. They're both put to death. Verse 13, the verse in question, speaks of homosexual relations. They're to be put to death. Verse 14 speaks of a man marrying a woman and her mother. They're both to be put to death. This isn't various ceremonial laws. This is a whole section on sexual laws and ethics, which Those other cases, usually we agree. Those things are wrong and ought to take place. Verse 15 and 16 speak of bestiality, and all parties, both the people and the animals, are put to death. This is not merely ceremonial laws. These are not merely ceremonial actions. Okay, both 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 9 and 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 10 condemn homosexuals. There has been some attempts to say, well, that's not really talking about homosexuality. That's really talking about using a male prostitute or a female prostitute of the same gender. The term is the regular term that's used for that. Attempts to retranslate that to say something different just don't have any merit. They're trying to reinvent the Greek language in order to justify their position. The phrase we've already looked at, that arsenoikotes, arsene, or arsene is just the Greek word for male. Koite is the Greek word for bed. It's a polite way of saying someone who takes a male to bed. Just like we have figures of speech today, we say people are sleeping together. We don't mean that they're just taking a nap. It's a euphemism. It's a nice way of saying that they're engaging in some sort of sexual activity. Nowadays, I guess there's a new phrase that's being used. I've heard this called hooking up. There's no hooking involved, but it's just a phrase that's used to describe a polite way, maybe not so polite way, of describing some sort of sexual activity. It's claimed by some that David and Jonathan were homosexual lovers. The evidence, quote unquote, that's used for this is the song of David at the death of Solomon. He sings or says, "I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You've been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women." Now, the context isn't talking about sexual activity, so I think perhaps you're reading something into the passage that isn't there. Yes, there was a deep bond of affection, of love. Let me just use that term, between two men. And that can exist without it having any sort of sexual overtones. Let me add that even if that had been the case, and I don't think there's any evidence that it was, if that had been of some sort of sexual nature, that still would not justify it, because David did things that were wrong. He engaged in adultery. He engaged in basically what amounts to murder in the case of Bathsheba's husband Uriah. That doesn't make it right. So the idea that David and Jonathan were homosexual lovers, first of all, I think what we have here is the use of poetic hyperbole. That is that, in fact, even in the same song, it says that Saul and Jonathan were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. And we're not supposed to take that literally. It's a figure of speech. It's poetic language, which is sometimes spoken of in that hyperbole sort of way, where you describe something larger than it really is. Saul is described, it says, Saul clothed the daughters of Israel in scarlet and ornaments of gold. That doesn't mean he clothed everybody like that. It's just a way of describing the great prosperity that took place. Descriptions of love are appropriate, and they were used here. All of Israel and Judah, we read, loved David in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 16. That doesn't mean they were all involved in some sort of sexual encounter with him. No, they loved him, and it's expressing that reality. And as we said, even if that had taken place, their actions would not make it right. Now, there's really two issues. The first is the ethical issue. The second is the emotional issue. Ethical, the homosexual activity, is described in the Bible as being sinful. It's not the feelings that are necessarily sinful, but it's the engaging in that activity. Now, people with there's also the situation in which there are people who struggle with the temptation to have same gender sexual activity. Having the temptation is not in itself, oh my goodness, I had a temptation to, do. It's what you do with it. It's what you do with that temptation. And different people are tempted by different things. There are certain sins that, frankly, I'm just not tempted with. They're just not inviting to me. There are other sins that with which I do struggle, and that's the same with everyone. Everyone has their areas of strength, and everyone also has their areas of weakness. In his book, False Intimacy, Schomburg says sin is not about behavior, but about our defiant claim to the right to rule our own life. Now, he's not saying that the behavior doesn't matter. Yes, it does matter, but the deeper issue is who rules your life. Is God ruling your life? Or are you saying, God, I don't care what you say, I want to have my own way? Spurgeon, in a sermon, says, thoughts are the eggs of words and actions, and within the thoughts lie compacted and condensed all the villainy of actual transgressions. That is, when we begin to harbor a desire and take it and work with it and want it and let it grow within us, then comes forth from that desire the actual sin. Sort of like a bird laying eggs. Don't lay eggs in your soul.